I want to welcome you to the Blaine House, since 1919, the home of Maine's governors and their families. The house was actually built in 1833 by a Captain James Hall from Bath, Maine. For those of you who know Maine, Bath is a major shipbuilding and seaport town, and Captain Hall decided in 1830 to retire from the sea. He bought this very strategically located piece of land right across from the State House that year, 1830. And in 1833, he finished construction on a very handsome two-story hip-roof federal house, which was to be his retirement home. One of the early features that survives in the house from his time is this beautiful winding staircase. And I think it's a tribute to the architecture of the staircase that subsequent owners of the house and subsequent generations have never changed it. It goes right back to the 1830s. Well, in 1862, James G. Blaine and his wife acquired this property. Blaine lived here until his death in 1893. Mrs. Blaine kept the property till her death in 1903. And then after World War I, their daughter, Harriet Blaine Beale, donated the house and grounds to the state of Maine for the purpose of a governor's home. Sadly, Harriet Blaine Beale had lost her son, Walker Blaine Beale, in World War I. And he had actually owned the house, and then upon his death, the house reverted back to her. And she, recognizing that it probably wasn't going to go on in the family, and in addition to that, recognizing the need that Maine had and the close proximity of the Blaine House to our State House across the street, she donated the house for the purpose of the governor's home. This is the state reception room. When the house was built in 1833, this was 2 rooms, and then when the Blaines acquired the house in 1862, in 69, and again in 1872, they made some major changes to the house, which included opening up both these 2 rooms into one big reception room. This really reflects the fact that in the Blaine period of ownership, from 1862 into the early 1900s, that there was a lot of entertaining that went on in this house related to Blaine's role as a leader of the Republican Party, both in Maine and in the nation. He was a newspaper editor of the Kennebec Journal. Then he went from there to being a state representative in 1859. He was the Speaker of the State House of Representatives. He moved on to become a congressman in 1863. That lasted until the mid-1870s when he became a senator. James G. Blaine tried 3 times to run for president. In 1876, was the first time, and that's when he really had the most momentum. He was very much focused on moving quickly from being Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives into the presidency. He narrowly missed that nomination. It went instead to Rutherford B. Hayes. Then in 1880, his name was put in nomination, but he again did not have quite enough support. And then finally, in 1884, he was nominated, and he ran against Grover Cleveland and narrowly lost in that national election. This is Mr. Blaine's study and library, and this is part of the addition to the house that the Blaines made in 1872, and it's the room that still remains the closest to what Blaine and his family would have known back in the Victorian period. When the house became the home for the governors in 1920, the decision was made to preserve this room much as it was in the earlier period. So it's become the repository for many artifacts that relate to Blaine. The first one we'll look at is Blaine's desk when he was editor of the Kennebec Journal. He came to Augusta in the 1850s to be a newspaper editor, and this desk was made especially for him at the time. And then when he left the newspaper to go on for his political career, the desk stayed there. And in recent years, the Kennebec Journal, which is still being published every day, it's our oldest continuous newspaper in Maine, they very kindly gave the desk to the Blaine House so that it can be viewed by the public. Now, our second desk that we're looking at is a much more elaborate one. When the U.S. Capitol was expanded in the late 1850s and early 1860s, Thomas U. Walter, who was the architect for that expansion, designed these very elaborate desks and chairs for the senators. In the 1870s and 80s, as senators would use these and then retire, they would be able to take them with them. And so Blaine took this as a memento and brought it back to his home here in Augusta. There's a particularly interesting feature here, and that is this little feature that opens on the desk. And this card is very precious in that it was written for Blaine by Abraham Lincoln. Richmond, the capital of the Confederacy, was open to be able to be visited. It had recently fallen. And so Lincoln wrote this authorization: allow the bearer, Honorable Mr. Blaine, to pass from City Point, that was in Virginia, to Richmond and return. A. Lincoln, April 7th, 1865. 2 days later, General Lee surrenders to General Grant at Appomattox. And then within a few days, April 14th, Lincoln is assassinated. This is a very historic photo that reflects the fact that in the summer of 1889, Mr. and Mrs. Blaine, shown in the photograph in the center, Mrs. Blaine in the white dress, James G. Blaine to the right, that they invited the President of the United States, Benjamin Harrison, to spend several days with them at their summer home in Bar Harbor on Mount Desert. One of the reasons, of course, for this presidential trip to Maine was the fact that James G. Blaine at that time was serving in Benjamin Harrison's cabinet. Blaine had been U.S. Secretary of State under Garfield and briefly under President Arthur, but then in 1889, Benjamin Harrison appointed him Secretary of State, and he held that position through most of the Harrison administration.
Now, where did Blaine get most of his money from?
Well, there is a lot of discussion about that, and his political detractors would have said that it was ill-gotten in some ways. That was one of the issues that he ran into when he was trying to get the nomination in 1876. Just at the time that he was vying for that nomination, issues came up about whether he had ill-gotten gains, so to speak, to simplify it. And that's one of the issues that made it difficult for him to obtain the nomination in 1876. But by the early 1880s, it was very clear that one of his major sources of income was the fact that he had written an extremely popular 2-volume memoir called 20 Years in Congress. It was a bestseller of its time. It sold tens of thousands of copies, and it netted him a great deal of money. We're now in the billiard room, which is one of the rooms that was built as part of the addition that the Blaines made to the house in 1872. This is also a room which has been a place to hang photographs and in some cases including the Christmas cards of the previous first families. The first family were the Millicans, and this was a large family, as you can see from the photograph. Carl E. Milliken and his wife are shown in the photograph along with their large family. There have been 21 families who have called the Blaine House their home, from the Millicans in 1920, currently to Governor Paul LePage and his wife, First Lady Anne LePage, beginning in 2011. Today, when we think of James G. Blaine in Maine, I think we think primarily of the Blaine House. It really is a symbol of both the Maine governorship and also of the state of Maine as a whole. I think it's probably as well-known a house as any in the state, and thus the equating of the name of Blaine with the governor's mansion really keeps his name alive and in the public today.